after a panel of speakers. Also, I have a request. If folks can remember, this is a theater, and if you want to go back into the work area or the exhibition area, remember that voice carries naturally here well, and so I'd appreciate it if you treat the back areas like an old-fashioned library and whisper, please. Otherwise, it's very disruptive to the speakers in the audience. Thank you. And now, Peter Meyers.
Can you hear me back there? Is that okay? Great. I'm a book lover, but I don't love all books. The ones that I love, this is my current favorite, Italo Calvino, If on a Winter's Night, A Traveler. I fall deeply in love with, and I spend a lot of time with, and I have no trouble staying committed from start to finish, and that's how I want to experience a book like this, in its entirety. But then there's everything else. There's all the books that I learn about every day on Twitter, in book reviews, from friends, and the pile and the list is overwhelming. And it creates in me a sense of anxiety. How can I get to finish all these books? I never will be able to finish all these books. So today what I want to talk about is a new proposed content design pattern called Skim Grok Master that addresses that problem. How can we read parts but not all of a book? How can we design the content in a book to allow a kind of high altitude skimming and occasional deep dive immersions? So for those books that we don't want to dedicate all of our time to, that we want to spend a little but not all of the duration of the book with, that we can still extract some value. We're already surrounded by examples of this system that I'm going to show a little bit about, and I want to start by just sort of taking a quick look at where we're starting to see these kinds of content design patterns already out there. The New York Times is a great one with its new product NYT Now. In its Skim version, you're moving through the articles, browsing very quickly, seeing what looks interesting. Grok is the form of the article where they now have 2 bullet points that give you the basic information about what's in the article. And then Master is when you want to do a deep dive. Skim, Grok, Master. It's happening in other places too. Facebook's Paper app is another good example. I'll show you a quick video. You've probably already used it yourself. Here, and I'll just play, you're in skim mode, you're browsing horizontally through the article choices, you find something that you like, you grok it, and then if it's interesting, you tap again and you go into Master. It's a pretty simple format. We're starting to see it in all sorts of content presentation, and not even news and articles, but in things like Tinder. You're skimming through various choices, you grok the person, see if they're interesting, and then if it's a match, you're in Master mode. I thought about putting a slide up there of them getting married, but anyway. But what does this mean for books? Probably implicit in what I've sort of the examples that I went through. Just before I get into some book implementations, you know, Skim in my mind is the lure. It's the way that we have of designing content for people who are moving through lots of choices very quickly. Grok is the essentials. It's the gist. It's the heart of, you know, what the message is, be it an article or a chapter or a book. And Master is that deep dive. Is the place where the reader is committed to learning everything that the author has to say. So what would this look like when it comes to books? Next example is from another book that I really enjoyed recently from Alain de Botton called The News, A User's Manual. Great book. This is a sort of a quick sample of this system using that book. The Skim version, this is just a section within a particular chapter. we get what you might recognize as a headline and a subhead. You can imagine a book containing dozens and dozens of these. Could be at the chapter level, could be at the section level, could be at the idea level. But in its Skim version, just basically giving people a way to choose from lots of these. Master is the same, sort of headline, but the gist. I didn't write anything new here. I went into his body text and I just plucked out a couple of sentences. And you see this as you start spending more time looking at authors and their writing. Oftentimes, even people who aren't writing things like abstracts and summaries can, if they're good writers, they write the essentials of what they're covering in a section or a chapter or a book. Master is pretty straightforward. At that point, if you're interested, tap, and then you go into the details. The interface really is not that important. I'm not interested here with whether there's paginated or scrolling or what have you. It could be done in any way. But let me talk a little bit more about these actual content elements that I'm sort of thinking of, and sort of first to start with Skim Grok Master at the book level. The Skim mode, our covers and our titles of the books essentially allow a kind of quick skimming. If you imagine a lot of different book titles and you're looking at them, you're in Skim mode. Grok, I here want to propose very briefly a new kind of content element, which I call the brief, and it's what I would suggest would be a replacement for the canned kind of marketing copy from the publisher that's written by somebody else about trying to get somebody to buy the book. The brief, to me, is in effect an executive summary from the author about what the book is about. It's an abstract, it's a summary, and I think it could really prove very interesting, not only for sales, but also for people who currently own a book and want to go back to refer to it. Master is the entire book itself. At a chapter level, the chapter title, I put down here, key question. Sometimes chapter titles either don't exist or are a little bit opaque in terms of what they tell browsers about what's in a chapter. And here I'm particularly referring to nonfiction. So I think about things like key questions that can whet a reader's interest. Again, a lure, a kind of way of getting people to think, maybe there's something interesting there. I'm not too, I think you get the sense that this is a rough design pattern. So I pose here key question. There are many different ways you could sort of provide a hook or an entry point into a chapter. Key question, I think, is one way. Chapter summary would be the Grok version, and the master is the entire chapter itself. And then down just to the section level, you think about the A heads in the for sections, particularly in nonfiction material. Section summaries would be the Grok version, and then the entire section would be the master. So then let me just show you what I think of as, programmers talk about writing pseudocode. I would say what I'm about to show you here is a kind of pseudo UI, a kind of a sketch, not quite a wireframe, but a sort of a look. What would all this look like to an actual reader? How could we present this kind of these kinds of new content elements? Sorry, one last thing here. This is what I highlighted in red are the content elements that don't currently exist that would need to be created. Although even in my sort of brief experience kind of investigating these, a lot of this material is already in a book. It just needs to be pulled out with not much more work, I would say, than what we currently do with, say, indexing or, writing, marketing material. Anyway, so two different quick versions of what this would actually look like from a user's perspective. Again, the actual context of where this takes place. Is this on a tablet or on the web or on a dedicated e-reader? It doesn't really matter. I think you can get the sense that this could work in a lot of different reading environments. At the Skim level, if you had a collection, a grid-like system, a grid-like layout of all the chapters, you're basically just looking at the chapters in their Skim version. with their names, maybe with that key question. We recognize this, I think, as a pretty typical kind of design style for a web page or a magazine cover. Let's say the reader was interested in chapter 2 and they tap on it, pops up the Grok version, and then if they're really interested, they tap again and they get the master version. Again, the actual, final implementation I don't think is particularly important, whether this is, scrolling or paginated or whatever. There are a lot of different ways, I think, that we could, if we started designing and arranging information in this kind of system, present it. This was one in this kind of grid-like interface. But if you imagine other ways that we could start presenting books, particularly as we're here talking about books in browsers, as you all know, this couldn't be done tomorrow in any of the, the leading e-reading environments, but this absolutely could be done tomorrow on the web. What I've sort of drafted here are the chapters and the sections together in a kind of card-like design system, so you could sort of swipe through a lot of this stuff pretty quickly. If you weren't interested in chapter 1, you would swipe, it would all go away. You would then be looking at chapter 2. This is also pretty friendly and compatible, I think, with the way that we're starting to use our mobile devices, where we really, start taking advantage of the touch screen as we kind of navigate our way through content. So, some issues and some unknowns as I start kind of thinking through this. The first one is, and this comes up a lot as I share ideas like this, well, what does this kind of system mean for the book itself, the normal book reading experience, whether it's print or digital? In my mind, it coexists side by side. This doesn't, for many readers, or for some readers, require not reading books in their entirety. It just simply gives them an easier way, a more efficient way, to make their way through books that they're not willing to commit their entire time to. And then, if they are interested in reading the thing in its entirety, then it's trivial to then flip it back into a full version. This kind of system, as well, I think, works both across a corpus of many books and within an individual book. So I think if you think about this kind of reading system, it helps browsers at all levels, again, across a lot of books and within an individual book. Another question I have as I start thinking about things like this is, would it change writing? I think about writers, just to totally name drop two random ones, Foucault and McLuhan. Can you imagine McLuhan trying to summarize in 2 bullet points what the next 10 pages are going to be about? So maybe we don't want him and those kinds of writers, and certainly not in fiction. I probably should have said up front that a lot of what I'm talking about here is really best suited for nonfiction. But I can also imagine how it would start nudging writers to surface the points that they're really concentrating on in the sections ahead, and in some cases create better writers, because it would really force people to think through, well, what actually am I saying here? What is sort of the headline takeaways? These are just a few of the questions that come up. I think the thing I'll sort of wrap up on is, a lot of what we've seen to date, even depending on how long you measure the beginning or how far we're into this so-called ebook digital publishing revolution, a lot of what we've seen are work on the design, the visual design presentation, things like typography, and then on another front in kind of computational tools, sort of automated reading systems like we saw from the previous speaker. But we haven't seen a lot of, at least in my experience, is work on the actual content itself and giving people and readers tools to navigate their way more efficiently through an ever-increasing pile of books. And I think what will sort of once again increase the level of reader interest in ebooks, because right now, we've kind of flattened out a little bit, is when our digital books start doing things that we can't do in print. So this would be the one interface that I left out where this doesn't work at all, Skim Grok Master, is in the print book. I mean, you really can't implement this in print. It has to be done digitally. And if we start doing things like this, I think then you finally start really giving readers a reason to prefer the digital version over print. And then the final last pitch I'll make is that, you know, we're here again talking about books in browsers. These are the kinds of innovations that I think probably are not going to happen at a large publisher level, but at a smaller publisher level, this kind of experimentation could take place, and it could be interesting to see if people like it. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for questions, and Ben, if he's around. There he is. Okay. Questions? Ah, okay.
This is a question for Pete. You said there at the end of your talk that this can't be implemented in print. And I'm curious about your reflection on, if you look at something like Bloomberg Business Suite, which is pulled out, you know, bullet points in the front of the article, and then they give you a sort of arrow at the end which tells you why this is important, what's the context of what you should take away from that. That seems like a model that's been sort of experimented with and seems to work really nicely in that context. Are you entirely sure that this could be implemented as print, at least for that type of information, newspapers, magazines, the type of things that are themselves typically skimmed and Grok that never really massive? So just to make sure I understand the question, am I sure that it wouldn't work in print? Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, I don't want to issue too many caveats, but I think I start the whole thing by presenting to you, my fellow kind of book thinkers, I don't even know if this will work at all. I think it will. I think it sort of addresses a pain point and an opportunity. But to your question, would it work in print? Yeah, I can imagine a design version where it could be done, you know, I mean, similar to sort of what we see in the example you cited or in abstracts in academic literature. I do think that there's something particularly useful about the digital version of a book where you can start letting people navigate in kind of a high velocity way. I mean, if you think about one of the things that's been so transformative about these touchscreen devices is it's in the thumb, right? I mean, you really can make your way through quite quickly if you're thinking about moving through your Twitter newsfeed, just a lot of media. And you could print out a Twitter feed and, you know, design it on a page and all the information would be there. But there's something about the velocity of our reading speed, I think, that's particularly conducive to being done on screens, but could be done, I think, in print.
Repeat the question for the
So the question was about how to actually make this feasible in a production environment, if I understand it correctly. Yeah. Yeah, of course, this is something that could or should be done in the publication process. So once you made your book, you actually annotate it as well. That's one way of doing it. The second way of doing it is actually kind of having an in-between level, like an extra server somewhere out there that you can actually say, okay, this is an EPUB or an HTML page, and I want to get the data out of it, and then that extra service indexes the EPUB and has its own extra annotated version on it on the server. You could also have something like a browser plugin that kind of does that on the fly. There are some possible ways of doing it, but indeed, if you want to have some kind of enduring way of having this, that's something that should be done in the publication process. That's true. But there are indeed certain publish processes where that actually could be very beneficial. And I'm thinking about stuff like the Gutenberg project, where it's like an extra step that would give a lot of more information to a reader, which might be considered.
Okay, lots of hands. Adam?
So the question is whether a model like this Skim Grok Master would be applicable in group writing environments. I haven't thought about group writing really deeply and closely in a couple of years since somebody shared with me a kind of a startup idea on it. And I think what tripped me up there back then was trying to think through use cases beyond the most successful example of Wikipedia. I talked earlier about anxiety. My anxiety level rises to the next level when I think about the pain I go through writing on my own, and then thinking about writing as a group project. So that's sort of one thing that sort of kind of steered me away from thinking about spending a lot of time on group writing. But thinking on the fly about that scenario, I think one thing that could be interesting is the way in which this kind of structuring helps people, particularly writers who are not, at the top echelon, who sort of can regulate themselves and really, provide great reader service. But everyone in that sort of lower, below 90% or whatever, this kind of system could help, keep people organized. Have we checked off the Skim version? Have we checked off the Grok version? And the one other thing, again, just to reiterate, I know I have the luxury of operating, such as it is, at a very rough, broad, abstract level, but this is one reason why, for those different content elements, I really kept it. If this thing ever made its way into the wild, I wouldn't want it to be overly regimented so that every single, Grok version of a chapter had to have 2 bullet points. That's where we always end up in trouble. And I understand the value of systematizing, but I think when we get too regimented, it gets in the way. But anyway, back to your question, I think it could work. I think in group writing environments, and I think it could help channel people and keep them kind of organized.
Okay. Doug, did you have a question?
Yeah. Ben, I'm about to say something nice about Amazon. So I come to marry Amazon, not to praise it. The Kindle Touch, I think the app version on OS, on iOS, etc., has something called Xray, which does pretty much exactly what you're talking about. And I'm wondering is there something unique or distinct about yours do you know about Xray?
Yeah, I've heard of it. So the question was, you've got the Kindle Xray, and it's kind of exactly what I'm talking about. Yes, but you have a lot of these things. I can remember Pressbooks has something similar as well. The problem is that it's always like a website environment, a closed-off system, ecosystem where you can do it. But that stands in the way of really interlinking the books. Now you can do that on Amazon, on Kindle. I'm talking about having like a generic way of doing that with all the books in the world.
Okay, there was some, Raymond.
So your talk makes me think that, for let's say tomorrow's Hack Day, that a group of us should be able to use something like OpenCalais, download the Project Gutenberg version of Meyers, apply it, and then turn it into a SparkHole endpoint. So what would be the barriers we would encounter in trying to do that tomorrow?
Well, as for one, you've got the entity recognition of OpenCalais, DBP, but although they're not 100% perfect. You've got stuff like Paris will probably once or twice will be recognized as Paris Hilton in Les Miserables, which is completely wrong, I hope. So that's indeed one. Second is that those services are mostly targeted to small parts of text, whilst in a book you have the advantage that you have a very large corpus, and that's something that's not really researched at the moment. You do some entity disambiguation on pretty small portions of text, but once you have an entire book, you have a lot more context, and that would probably influence your entities. So that's one of the problems you may encounter. To make a scalable Sparkle endpoint out of every book will probably also be something not as easy, because something like a Sparkle server is a very intense, very complex system that needs a lot of processing power. So you cannot accept every server in the world to actually host something like that. So that's certainly another problem in there. Yeah, on indexing. Yeah, so that's indexes are a very useful source of information, because they actually already say like what are the entities inside the book. So basically, what you should do is something like you do the entity disambiguation on the indexes, and then you already have some kind of a link with that. So it's certainly very useful, but the thing is that you're not going to index your entire book in your index. Like, for example, for Les Miserables, you're not going to mention every place Jean Valjean is mentioned, because then your index would be ginormous. I don't know if you saw the figure, there were like 1,100 mentions of Jean Valjean. If you do that in your index, it would not be user-friendly anymore, I guess. So in a way, you kind of need the annotations inside the book yourself, because if you're going to do it like on the index level, it might be like a little bit too much information at one place, I guess. But it's certainly something. Yeah, no, that's true. For skimming and grokking, I can certainly see index being a lot more useful. It's more about more detailed analysis, like the example I mentioned, like the storyline, which character has a scene with which character at what point in the book or something. For that you need more fine-grained analysis, and that is, I think, more something for inline annotations.
Okay, wait, there was a question here. Okay, Steve was first, sorry.
Peter, the formal properties of printed books have evolved over hundreds of years and been standardized. Everything from the title page to the table of contents to footnotes to the index. I wonder if you think about your system in relation to those structures as creating affordances for digital media. I know, for example, it used to be in some novels you found a summary of the chapter in the beginning.
Yes, yes. So I think the question is about, how could this kind of, maybe thoughts on whether these kind of new content entities will, where will they fit in the evolution of the book? Because as you know, we haven't always had, how old, maybe somebody here knows the answer, how old are indexes? About 150, 200 years old, older? But anyways, there's this evolution of the book. The table of contents, I know, also is a, 500, Johanna, I think, would know. Right. Was that sort of the question?
I'm just wondering if you think of it in those terms.
Absolutely. I mean, I think of the book as a, particularly, I think of the book as a living technology. And I think if we think about the history of the book, it has absolutely evolved. And so much of what I think we've experimented with over the past, 10 or so years tends to be very asset-driven, very tech-driven. An iPad can accommodate video, so let's put video in. I tend to think that if we spend more time thinking about tools that will empower readers, we can hit a sweet spot. We've clearly arrived at some pretty tangible data that, at least right now in their first wave of examples, readers are not really interested in enhanced books. And I think that's not, in hindsight, that surprising. We're in an age of more. We all have too much, and enhanced books give people more. So it's not, for most people, really interesting. I think tools like this start chipping away at that problem of making readers more efficient, recognizing the ways that our reading habits have changed over the past decade or so with high-altitude skimming and deep dives and things that we're interested in. So that's...
Okay, I think last question, Bob.
Bob Foster, University of California. I just want to make the observation that this isn't an either-or thing. I mean, when I did a book last year as an editor, I used named entity recognizers and text analyzers as a way to help develop an index, which was actually a human developed index, and then to refine my market with the text, and sort of this iteration around, am I getting all of my stuff in the book marked up, and then these things like indexes. So it's like these tools are complementary. It's not like we replace people with machines. We use these tools together.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's also what I mentioned about disambiguation. There are errors in there. So you certainly, it's not like we're going to make an automatic indexer, because not always the machines will get what is important, because like the word "the" is like the most important word of the book, but yeah, that's useless. So indeed, yeah, it's a process, indeed.
Okay, thank you. So we go on to break. And John and Adam, if you want to test lock and load, here's a good time. Also, we still have a fair number of white T-shirts, and we really don't want to truck them back to New York. So if you would like a white T-shirt, please feel free to grab one or two. And there are a fairly large number of women's cut T-shirts. So if you were...
We get two. So if you've already gotten a gray T-shirt, we're entitled to...
Yes. Okay. Oh, the other guy.
Hey, thank you. That was great. The reason I asked this question is that I designed a platform for use and overview like this.
Oh, okay. What about in the open source world?